Hi everybody, it's Courtney, and today we are going to be creating a Slimline one-layer card with several different stamp sets from Simon Hurley Create. We have Cakewalk, Bestest Friends, Space Training, and Trampoline Friends. And I'm just going to be using a couple of images from each set. So I have a piece of the Stark White cardstock also by Simon Hurley Create, and I'm going to start off just by drawing a very light pencil line using my T-square ruler along the bottom, and this will basically be the back of my little table. We are going to create a birthday party scene here, and this will just act as a guide so that I know where to do my stamping. Now, if you've watched my videos before, you'll know that I typically cut my masks out ahead of time and I use them as my guide, and I typically use a stamp positioner to stamp all of my images. For this particular card, I'm just going for it. I have an idea in my mind, but I'm not laying everything out first. I'm cutting my masks as I go along, just to kind of show you guys that there's multiple ways to do this. So I am going to, most of these stamps I've never stamped before, so I'm going to stamp them out onto my masking paper first and kind of get those, you know how some new stamps just don't stamp right. So this way I'll get one stamping out of the way before actually bringing that to my card. Now you'll always want to make sure that you're stamping front to back. So any image that's in front of another, you'll want to stamp and mask first. So this bear is going to be the star of the show. It's his birthday party, and he's going to be holding his birthday cake. So because I want his little arms or his little paws to be in front, because I want him to be holding the cake, I'm going to stamp him first. And you can see that I have my masking paper off to the side, and I'm also going to cut that mask. Now I'm stamping, or I'm cutting right along that black line, right on the black line. And this way, once I do my ink blending in the background, I won't end up with that white outline that you sometimes get when you ink blend around masks. You just want to be able to cut right on that black line as much as you possibly can. Now I just kind of cut a large opening in the center, and this will be where my cake goes. You'll see in just a minute here that I had to kind of alter this a little bit once I went to stamp out my actual cake. So I masked him out, inked up my little cake there, and realized that it was going to cover up a lot of the mask. So I'm just using my scissors here and just lifting up little bits and pieces of the mask and cutting a little bit more to make room to stamp out my cake. Now once I do the stamping, you'll see that one of the candles, or the flame on the candle at least, was still a little bit over my mask. Not a huge deal. We can always fix up any of those errors once we have all of our stamping and everything complete before we start the coloring. So went ahead and stamped the birthday cake, and for the mask for that one, I didn't really worry about the candles, being that's going to be over this little bear's body anyway, and it just saves me some time from having to cut those little intricate areas on that mask. So lined that up, and then we are going to start stamping everything else. So I have all of the images from all of the different stamp sets kind of laid out on my work surface so I can do one at a time. Remember, now we're going to stamp front to back. So I'm just kind of laying things on the table as far as this little present and the cupcake, and I'm stamping once on the masking paper, and then I will bring that to the paper. I'm cutting my mask, like I said, as I go along. And the easiest way to cut masks is to cut the masking paper itself into smaller pieces, just a little bit bigger than the object. That way you don't really have to worry about any excess hanging off and getting in your way as you're doing your cutting. Now I want my little monkey to be wearing a party hat. So I'm going to kind of line up the monkey image, and so I know where it's going to go, and then stamp that little hat down so that it will look like it's actually on top of his head. Masked all of those images out, including this little teeny tiny party hat, which I've learned the first time it was very difficult to cut. So I'll show you a different way to mask this out in just a minute. But once that is masked out, then I can stamp out my monkey, and it will appear as if he is wearing that hat. I masked out that monkey, and then I want to do the same thing as far as the party hats go for this little cat and dog that are from the Space Training stamp set. These two characters will look as if they're sitting at the table with this bear. So again, I'm going to make them wear party hats, but I just don't want to cut those little tiny hats. So I'm going to line up the images again where I want them and then stamp out the little hat so that it will look as if these characters are wearing the hat. But instead of cutting out the masks for these little hats this time, I am going to use a different option as far as your masking goes. I am going to be using liquid Frisket, which is basically a liquid masking fluid. There's all different brands. You just want to make sure if it comes in one of these little jars that you don't shake it, you kind of twirl it, because it makes a lot of bubbles and it won't really work properly if you do that. I still had an air bubble, but it was no big deal. You want to make sure that you're using a paintbrush that you don't care about. Get the ones from the craft store that are like $5 for $1 or something like that, because they won't last long if they last at all. It kind of gets gummy, but you will want to make sure that you wash it right away with really hot water, and usually you can get at least a few uses out of it. I let that dry for maybe about 2 or 3 minutes. It doesn't take too long. And then I can stamp out my cat and my dog. Again, I'm also stamping out on that masking paper because I want these images to be masked for the ink blending that we'll do here in just a minute. Finally, I am going to finish off with some of the balloons, and there's balloons in a couple different stamp sets, so I just grabbed one, and I am stamping a couple on the left hand side and a couple on the right hand side. I do also have the masking paper off to the side because I want two of these balloons to kind of be overlapping each other, so you want to make sure that you mask one before you stamp out the second one. You can see I also used a piece of Post-it note tape just to put on that pencil line so that my balloon strings don't go onto what will be my little table there. So I'm not worried about cutting the masks of the balloon strings, obviously. I can always go over those with a pen later if I kind of lose the intensity of the bold black outline. Not a big deal. So once all of my images were finally stamped and masked, I am going to go ahead and move on to the ink blending. I am using the Woof ink by Simon Hurley Create, and I'm just using this one single color just to add a little bit of color to the background so it's not just stark white. I'm going to start right on that Post-it note tape and kind of work my way up so it almost fades to just about white. It has just a little tint of color, and I chose this color because it is more of a neutral tone, and in order for all of my little characters and all of the balloons and birthday cakes and all of that stuff to really stand out, I wanted the background to be more subtle. So I'm going in with a very light hand and I'm just gradually building up that color. I don't want it too dark. The great thing about the Simon Hurley inks is that you can really build up your color. I could make this super intense if I wanted to, or I can go in with a really light hand and I don't get those streaky lines that you sometimes get with regular dye ink. So I can go ahead and remove that Post-it note tape here, and I want to make sure that I have a line that will kind of be the back of my table. So I'm just removing the masks of the cat and dog because they kind of hang over, and I'm keeping the other masks in place just in case I go a little bit too far with my pen. That way the masks will kind of save that, but I'm just using that pencil line that I originally had there as my guide as far as where I need to draw in that line. I am going around the images, but you know, just in case, because I tend to get a little carried away sometimes. So once that's done, I went ahead and erased my pencil lines. Well, first I'm removing my masks, and normally I wouldn't keep all of this in here, but I know that I get a ton of comments that you guys love to see the reveal and removing of the masks. So I kept all of this in here, and you can see that my scene is really starting to come together. Now, before I start my coloring, I do want to make sure that I do erase the pencil lines that are hanging over the cupcake and the little monkey and the bunny, because once you color over pencil lines, you're not going to be able to erase the pencil lines. So always make sure that you erase those first before moving on to your coloring. Now I am going to speed up the coloring just a little bit. Otherwise this video would have been about 40 minutes long, and I'm sure you guys don't want to sit here that long with me. So I have it sped up a little bit more than I normally do, but of course I am going to be using my Copic markers. So I'm starting off with this little bear here. Well, first I fixed that little flame and then I'm going to move on to the bear. So I'm going to start off with the E53, which is my lightest color. And this is just to get the paper a little saturated and to also map out my darkest areas so I know exactly where I want to place my shadows. For this entire card, I'm just using a center light source to kind of keep things a little bit easy. Once I have that lightest color to map out my darkest areas, I'll move on to the darkest color, which is the E59, and I'm pretty much just going over those same areas that I had mapped out. I'm adding a little bit of shading on either side of his body and on the inside of his little arms or legs or paws or whatever you want to call them, and on top of his little nose or snout, whatever. Moving on to the E57, I'm going to extend those areas out a little bit further, and then I also added a little bit of shadowing underneath his little mouth. Now you can see that because I used an acrylic block and because I haven't really stamped with these images before, and my ink pad is a little dry, I didn't get a great impression. And the outline of the images doesn't really matter too much, especially once you have your coloring done. But you can see, especially around his mouth and his nose, it's a little bit blotchy. And that's a combination of different things. It's a huge image, and I would have normally used a stamp positioner, but I just wanted to show you guys that you don't necessarily need one. So I'm going to take a Copic Safe pen. This is just an EK Success journaling pen, which they no longer make, but I will link something very similar below, and it's about the same price point. And I'm just going to go over this area that should have been completely black and just going around his little teeth there. I went in and added a little bit of color to his tongue and took a white gel pen to add that reflection back into his nose. Next, we're going to move on to the monkey, and I'm going to move on to some E30 markers, and his little face and his belly are just going to be just a little bit lighter than the rest of his body. Even though I'm using the same blending family, for his body, I'm going to go one step darker. So I'm going to use the E37 as my darkest color. And for his little face, my darkest color will be the E35. And I brought in an E30 as my highlight color. So it's just going to be a tad bit different. You can go real extreme here if you want to, but I just kept it nice and simple. I also added a little bit of a shadow underneath where his party hat would be, kind of hanging on top of his head or laying on his head. That would be just a little bit darker. Next, we're going to move on to this little bunny, and I want this to be a very light gray. So I'm going to bring in my cool gray markers. Oh, well, first I did the same thing with my EK Success journaling pen for that monkey as well. So now we really are going to move on to the bunny, and I'm going to start right with my darkest color, which is the C5. I find that the C markers and all gray markers, really, they blend really nicely, so I don't necessarily need to go in with my lightest color first to get the paper saturated. And honestly, once you color one of these little characters, you kind of have a pretty good idea of where your shadows are going to be, so I don't necessarily need to map them out and kind of plan them out. I pretty much already know. I did add a little bit of pink inside of his little ears, and for this cat, I am also going to use some cool grays for his little chest area there. I wanted this to look white, so I'm just adding just a little bit of shading with the lighter grays. And then for his body, I want him to be a black cat, or a very dark gray anyway. So I'm going right in with my black marker and adding my shadows pretty much the same way as I did with the bear and the monkey and the bunny. And I am going to use the C7 as my darkest midtone. You can see that I use the black marker very sparingly because I don't want to go over his eyes with that, or else I'm going to completely lose his eyes. I'm not really worried about his whiskers because we're going to fix those with a white gel pen later. But my lightest color here is actually going to be the C3. So I'm not going any lighter than the C3 for his actual body. So for the inside of his ears as well, I'm going to use that same pink marker that I used for the bunny. And I really wasn't liking my blend, so I did have to go back in with that C3 just to kind of get everything a little bit more smooth. Finally, we have the dog, and I'm going to move on to some more E markers here, but again, starting off with my lightest color. And the main reason why I'm doing that is because the color combination that I'm using here doesn't always blend perfectly. there's kind of a big difference in between, especially the lightest midtone and the lightest color. I'm kind of limited on my options right now. I know I've said in plenty of videos by now, but Copic refills are very hard to get right now, or almost impossible. And all my markers are starting to dry up. So my options are limited as far as my colors go. So I'm pretty much just adding my shading the same way as I did for all the other characters, including that little shadow underneath his party hat. And now we are going to bring in that EK Success journaling pen again for his little nose. And once that dries, because the ink does take a couple of seconds to dry for these journaling pens, I added that little highlight to his nose again. So now we're going to bring in some color to this. We've used all neutral tones. Now we're going to bring in the color. So I'm going to start with a BG combination, and I'm using these pretty much in threes. So I'm going to use this combination for the frosting on this little cupcake. And I'm also going to add this to one of the balloons. Now I'm not going to show you the coloring of all of the balloons because I did the shading the same exact way. I will show you all of the different color combinations that I used. I'm just not going to show you all of them because it is pretty repetitive. But I added a little bit of shading in the center on the bottom, and I'm just adding these curvy lines on either side and just extending them out each and every time. And this will give the illusion that it's more transparent and very shiny. So I also colored every other candle with the same color combination. I just skipped the darkest color, just because these areas are really tiny. You could probably get away with just 2 color combination here. So next we are going to move on to a YG combination. Well, there's one G. So we're just going to say a yellow-green combination. And all of the coloring is very simple on this, but I did leave at least most of it in just so that you could see the color combinations that I used. But for this little bow, I'm just adding some shading where it's kind of bunched together. And for the little party hat here, I just colored every stripe. I didn't bother to do any shading there. And as you can see, I colored one of the balloons. Now, moving on to the purple combination, I am coloring his little collar here. And I'm just adding some shading on either side. Again, we have a center light source, but we also have a round object. So this would be around his neck. It would be a round object. So there would still be a center highlight for that as well. Coloring the little border on the cake. I'm not worried about shadows as far as light source goes, but if you guys have ever decorated a cake, you kind of like bunch these up as you're going. So where it's kind of bunched up or where these little areas begin, I'm adding just a little bit of shading. And again, I just use a 3 color combination here because the areas are so tiny. Also colored another balloon with this color combination. Next, moving on to some yellows for this little party hat. I'm just adding a little bit of shading on either side. And you can see that the darkest color that I have here is actually an orange. So whenever you're using yellows, it's kind of tough to get some dimension to it or some contrast. So I recommend, if you want it to be bright and cheery, to use a YR marker for your darkest color. If you want it to be more of a golden yellow, I would recommend an E marker. So I colored the cupcake wrapper with that. And then the little flames on the candles, I'm just using the orange, which is the YR04, and the Y04 for the rest of them. Next, moving on to the pink combination, pretty much keeping everything the same. Once I started coloring this little present here, I realized that the pink combination that I chose is very red, especially the darkest colors. They're more red than they are pink. And I had the little bow being green, and it reminded me way too much of Christmas. Wasn't really loving it, but it is what it is at this point. I'm going to keep going with it. I am also going to color in every other candle, if I could think of the word, with this same color combination. Again, just skipping one, just using a 3 color combination for that, and also filling in one of these balloons. Now for the little cake part of the cupcake, I'm just going to use 2 colors here because it's not a huge area, and I also don't want to kind of drag out any of the color that I put on there already. So I'm just using the E23 and E21. And for the cake, I want this to appear white as if it has white frosting on it, but anything that's white still has some shading, especially around object. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading with my C markers, but still leave a ton of white space here to give the illusion that the object is white. We just have a little bit of shading. So now that my coloring is all done, I can color in my table. And I kind of debated as far as what color combinations to use for this. I really normally would just choose something like a C combination or a W combination, but my W markers, my warm grays, are shot. They are not usable right now. So I brought in a BV combination. BVs are not something that I typically use, so I figured they would be nice and inky, and I wouldn't run out of ink halfway through coloring in my table. So I went in with the darkest color to add a little bit of a shadow underneath each one of the objects. Then going in with the darkest midtone, and I'm just extending these shadows out a little bit. Shadows do not have to be perfect. No shadow is perfect. So don't stress yourself out over shadows, but I'm also adding a little bit of shading to the back portion of the table. If you ever Google a scene or anything like that, and you look at a large object like this table, the further back it gets, the darker it's going to appear because it doesn't have as much detail to it. So I just added a little bit of shading to the back, and I just extended that out with the lightest midtone as well, including the shadows underneath all of these objects. Then I can finish off with the B00, which is my lightest color, and I'm being careful not to go over the darkest areas because the lighter the color, the more it's going to act as a colorless blender, and it's going to move your color around. Not only is it going to move your color around on the table area, but it could also move your color around onto the images that we have already colored. We've spent way too much time doing that, so we just want to be careful that we don't oversaturate the paper here. So I finished off with a few white gel pen details, including the little cat's whiskers and some highlights here and there. And then I went ahead and stamped out the sentiment. And this one is from the Cakewalk stamp set, stamping that with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink right there in the center bottom. And on the inside of my card, I'm going to stamp another sentiment from that same stamp set. I'm taking the little bear from the Space Training stamp set and kind of just sticking him in the corner as if he's kind of peeking in the inside of the card. I'm not going to bother to do any coloring. This is just the inside to add a little bit of something because we have a whole lot of space to work with. So I can adhere my card panel down onto my card base now. And I'm just using some Tombow Mono multi glue for that. You can see I got a little bit of an ink smudge there. No big deal. It's going to be covered anyway. And then I brought out my glossy accents, which I have finally gotten. Actually, I haven't gotten it. I found it in a bin that I didn't even know existed in my craft room. So I'm going to cover up these balloons with the glossy accents. Now, these two balloons are touching. So I gave it about 15 minutes between adding the glossy accents to the first balloon. I did have some air bubbles, so I just popped those with the pin, and it's not completely dry after 15 minutes, but it's set enough where I can add the glossy accent to the second balloon. Now, once this is completely dry, which took about 2 or 3 hours or so, I can add some white gel pen highlights to the balloons right directly on top of the glossy accents. And it actually, if you add it before, the glossy accents kind of dissolves the white gel pen. So I prefer to do it after. Last, I added a little bit of shimmer to pretty much everything. And that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.